This is not your typical retrospective. This is a historical recount of sorts. A story of wonder, a story of fates, a story of a man and a monkey. This is the story of when Dean met Donkey. The moment my eyes opened on this big old ball we call Earth, I was destined to share a home with a Super Nintendo. It wasn't a choice I made. It was a decree cast upon me. I don't know exactly which game was the first game I ever played, but I have random memories of my older siblings throwing a controller in my hand and letting me try out a few games. For now, let's go back to the 80s. On one hand, you have a company founded by two brothers in the UK that was really beginning to shine well into the early 90s, with Battletoads. On the other hand, you have a monstrous arcade title featuring a giant ape, a damsel in distress, and a tiny dude playing the hero. Over the course of the next, 13 or so years, these franchises and their respective developers flourished. Jumpman would move on to become the face of gaming, and Rare would release what felt like about 500 different Battletoad games. But as the 90s continued, and the 80s moved further away into memory, there was a new challenge. Would these two separate but equal paths continue to rest on their laurels? Was Battletoads going to be Rare's peak? Was Donkey Kong just going to get ported on every single device imaginable? Well, let's be real. You know it wasn't the peak for either of those companies. For as popular and as renowned their previous ventures were, the serendipitous nature of their marriage would ultimately lead to one of the most iconic games in all of history, Donkey Kong Country. I won't claim to be an expert on the way Rare, or even Nintendo for that matter, develops games. And I'm not trying to turn this into a video that involves regurgitation of Wikipedia. But the way I always saw it was that when Rareware was looking for a way to both jump into the 2D platformer genre and simultaneously improve upon everything that came before it, by simply focusing on the two biggest names that came before, you can find many attributes that were borrowed and in some cases improved upon. Off the top of my head, you have an overworld, a rideable buddy, a companion that follows you along, collectibles, momentum-based speed, hidden bonus areas, and unique collectibles. And then, to top it off, you have the conversion of 3D models to 2D sprites that became famous through this game. It was glorious when it came out. You legitimately felt like you were a gorilla in the jungle. No mainstream video games had looked half as good as Donkey Kong Country did upon its release. And as a result, the game turned a lot of heads. And Nintendo leaned into the hype. For the first time since Mario jumped into the scene, they had faced stiff competition from Sega. And with Rare's new magnum opus, they were looking to take back their comfortable lead and destroy any chance of losing their grip on the industry. Everywhere you turned, you'd see the Kongs. Every billboard, magazine, and commercial. All of it was there to tell everyone that Donkey Kong was back, and this time, he was the hero. Remember in my Sonic 3 video how I mentioned Ice Cap Zone was the first time I ever felt you could describe a stage's music as atmospheric? Well, Donkey Kong Country's music is probably the first full game soundtrack I could actually describe as atmospheric. Plenty of audio aficionados have covered it. There are literally videos hours and hours long that describe what exactly it is about Donkey Kong's music that makes it so great. I'm probably disrespecting composer David Wise by even taking a stab at it. But here goes. There are two aspects of this game's soundtrack that I absolutely adore. One of them is the fact that it feels like the music is interacting with the environment. Whether it's the sound of your Kong buddy banging away in a barrel, the chomping rhythm of a claptrap as he maneuvers, the sound of water dripping into the cave, all of those aspects fit in so perfectly with the overarching theme going on in the background. It's something I wholly appreciate because it almost gives you the sense of existing in the world you're playing. And it's a trope that future Rare games will successfully continue to use. The second aspect of the soundtrack that lights a fire in me every time is the way the music transitions as you, and in extension it, proceeds through the stage. You heard the title theme. Starts out with a calm and easy introduction, and then blasts into a beat so hyped you'd basically regret hitting the start button to skip. The music in the first stage takes over a minute to get to the climax portion of it, and when it gets there, you can't help but bob your head along and keep your eyes pierced for the next major swing. The theme in the cave sets this amazing atmosphere, and you think the sound is working perfectly with the environment, and it can't get any better, until you get to around the, 2.5 minute mark, and hear this. That amount of detail into a soundtrack is incredible. A fast player might not even get a chance to hear that portion of the song, so when it strikes you, it almost blindsides you. This happens all throughout the game. The soundtracks are perfectly synchronized with the environment and the game's aesthetics, yet somehow, just as you get sucked into the already perfect theme playing, a fire sparks in your ears and shoots straight into your heart, and the song just gets that much better. And this is in addition to all of the perfectly acceptable soundtracks in the bonus areas, the overworld, and even parts of the game where you're talking to another character. I meant it when I said I don't know how to properly analyze a soundtrack. This is literally my first time I'm even making an attempt to do so. And really, the first time I'm putting such an important focus on the soundtrack of a game. Because for the first time in my channel, this is a game that's infinitely made better because of the soundtrack, rather than it just being an iconic, memorable bonus. This is what it looks like to be a monkey in a jungle. In a cave, on a mountain, or even on a minecart. Or at least that's what it felt like when I was a kid. When I played games before Donkey Kong, I never actually felt like I was in those games. They just felt like they were fun little cartoony looking things that I loved. But with Donkey Kong, it's almost like a 4D experience. You're on those vines avoiding those bees. You're blasting out of those barrels. You're, jumping on a burning barrel of oil? Yeah. Because this game looks and feels real. The aesthetics were not only revolutionary because of their method of implementation, they were also exemplary of the implementation of a proper art style that could fit perfectly with what the game's objectives are. The sequels to this game might be objectively better as a whole, but I'm not sure if the atmosphere of those games are captured quite as well as this one's is. Every level, every Kremling, every set piece doesn't feel out of place. And there's somehow a sense of realism to a game about two monkeys that are on a mission to recapture their bananas from a bunch of lizards by jumping on their heads and blasting out of barrels. If that's not an accomplishment in game design, then I don't know what is. Donkey Kong Country is a linear game, but that's not a bad thing by any means. There's an overworld in place that isn't really as nuanced as, say, Mario Worlds, but it fits the standard of what was being dished out when the game released. 6 worlds, 40 levels. Jungle Hijinks does everything it can teach you about how the game plays. Whether you charge forward to try to use your roll to make a longer jump, take a high jump to unleash an item, use your roll to continue your momentum, there's a lot to unpack here that on a first time playthrough you might not master or even pick up right away. But with time you'll learn there's a bit of skill involved to controlling the characters. Diddy Kong might be faster and have a further jump, but Donkey Kong is larger and can kill a handful of enemies that Diddy couldn't handle easily. Rambi the Rhino will not only show you how absolutely game-breaking he can be, if utilized properly, he'll also help you find your first hidden room without you possibly even intending to. Which is important because full completion of this game will require you to do quite a bit of exploration to find all of these bonus rooms. I might be jumping ahead a bit, but it is a fun little quest to find all of these rooms. I'm not really a fan of them and feel it could have been implemented better, and it was implemented better in later games actually. But regardless, it's a bonus and doesn't really make a significant difference to the game to actually go for full completion. Anyway, by the time you finish the first few stages, you should know all about the primary mechanics of this game. From rope climbing, to barrel blasting, to Kong letter collecting, to even wheel pushing. These are all tools used throughout the game that are objectives to get you to their next level. Heck, you'll even have your first water stage and probably feel the same sense of anxiety I used to feel in those levels because of how unforgiving they could be. Actually, the anxiety is probably down to the music and the aesthetics making you feel like you're deep in the ocean with the Kong brethren. That anxiety for me gets removed by riding On Guard though, so it's not all doom and gloom. World 1 is mostly jungle levels, with the introduction of the aforementioned water level and a cave level, which makes sense because it's called Congo Jungle. World 2 on the other hand takes place in the Monkey Mines. Here you see your first walkway level and find Winky the Frog, who is just the happiest little fellow I've ever seen in my life. And oh yeah, he kills bumblebees. I love this guy. Then you have your first minecart level, which is hard as hell the first time you play it, but you eventually get used to it. Especially after you Google the secret shortcut that lets you skip. I remember as a kid, until I figured out this shortcut, I was stuck at this level for what felt like months. The final 2 themes introduced in World 2 are the ruins and the mineshaft, the latter of which used to literally give me nightmares because of these over-affectionate, freaky-looking monster zombies or whatever. Again, once I discovered the secret for this level, this game became a lot more pleasant for me. World 3 takes place in Vine Valley, which introduces you to the forests. Honestly, the aesthetic for this level is my favorite, and the sounds the birds make when you kill them is really satisfying because of how frustrating some moments can be. And then the treetops, which always reminded me of the canopies the Ewoks lived in Return of the Jedi. The rest of the tropes in this world are repeated from the previous ones, but the skill level required to beat those stages is a lot more apparent now. You'll find yourself dying more often than you'd expect if this is one of your first few playthroughs. Which isn't all that bad because one of the best things about this game are the animations when you die or lose or the game over screen. And likewise, all the little celebrations that occur when you beat a bonus stage or finish a level. Small little features like this make the game so much more enjoyable. But before I leave World 3, I want to talk about one main thing. Well, two. I forgot to mention the ostrich. He's cool. Really fast, but not really my favorite animal buddy. He offers a half-decent glide, but it isn't all that. The other, and more important thing, is this guy right over here. The Lost Kong. Or orangutan, or whatever he is. In my headcanon, I used to think of this guy as the ultimate traitor. I mean, his name's Manky Kong. Manky Kong. This guy was clearly one of the boys. Somewhere along the line, he lost his way though. King K. Rool approached him and offered him Kong Island if he works for him and helps him screw over the family. And he did, because he was hungry for the power and was sick of DK getting all the praise. He was the one that allowed the bananas to get stolen and helped K. Rool succeed. He was the one that would have helped them escape if not for DK's and Diddy's heroics. He wanted to rule as the Emperor of the Banana Republic. He aimed too high, and as a result, he fell too hard. It was tragic. And it was all made up in my little 5-year-old head because apparently this is where I focused my brain power as a kid. I guess nothing's changed. World 4, Gorilla Glacier, finds you surrounded by snow levels that will obstruct your vision to ramp up the pressure on timing-sensitive barrel blasting sections, and ice levels that will see you slipping and sliding up and down the ropes to add a bit of challenge. I'd say World 4 is when the game takes the next step on the difficulty curve. You'll notice in all the stages going forward, and even the game's second minecart level, which has mechanics that are slightly different, but is still significantly harder than the first minecart level, because by now the game expects you to show a bit of mastery in its challenges. Or to keep getting game overs until you can figure out how to get through some of the difficult challenges. But if you're in World 5, you'll get to the factories of Premcock Industries Incorporated. Some of the hardest underwater and walkway themes take place in this world, and the factory levels both offer a new aesthetic and some unique challenges that you might not really face anywhere else in the game. And the challenges will just continue to come at you in full swing in World 6 Chimp Caverns, with all of these final stages that genuinely feel like the end of a 2D platformer. And then, you finally make it. All the way to the King of the Kremlings, King K. Rool. It's very important for me to note that I think this boss battle is really good. It offers multiple phases, attack and defense sections, a sense of strategy you're forced to figure out as you play, and even a fun little gotcha moment that wasn't all that common in gaming at the time. The reason all of this is important for me to note is because all of the other previous battles that I glossed over kinda stunk. In fact, they're so weak in generic basic bosses that they're not really even worth discussing. But the King K. Rool fight? Dare I say it's better than the Bowser fight in Mario World? Or at the very least it rivals it. It's a great ending to the first game, and really makes this already awesome adventure end on a high. Well, unless you're going for full completion, in which case I hope you like speaking of Cranky, Funky, and Candy Kong, because you'll need to utilize the 3 of them to figure out where the bonus areas are. Or if you're playing in 2022, you're probably using save states and guides online, so maybe you won't spend as much time talking to them as I did as a kid. You might be surprised that I decided to play this SNES version of Donkey Kong Country for this review, given my preferences towards the GBA versions of the Mario titles. And well, that's because in the Mario titles, I didn't think you were really losing all that much in the drop of quality from the Super Nintendo to the Game Boy Advance version. In fact, I think there was significantly more to gain. And while the GBA ports of Donkey Kong Country have some great quality of life improvements when it came to storytelling, saving, going for full completion, and all the other stuff you'd come to expect in the mid-2000s that weren't really all that common in the mid-90s, the fundamental issue I have with the Game Boy Advance ports is the drop in audio and visual quality from the SNES version of these games. I still think the Game Boy Advance games are great options to play if you're going for full completion of these titles and have already played the Super Nintendo versions, but unlike the Mario series, if you're a first timer then you have to start with the Super Nintendo version, even if it means not going for full completion. The atmosphere of the first Donkey Kong Country game in particular rivals any other game from the 2D era, and maybe even a large portion of the 3D era up until the 2000s. The Game Boy Advance ports just don't do it justice in that regard. But regardless, whichever version you play, you're in for a great time. The common view during my lifetime was always that Donkey Kong Country 2 was the better game, and I'm fairly certain I abide by that point of view as well. But Donkey Kong Country 1 gets a lot of disrespect it doesn't deserve, primarily from people claiming it's too repetitive. Of the 40 stages, there are 4 jungles, 5 caves, 4 underwater, 5 walkways, 4 mineshaft, 2 ruins, 2 forests, 2 treetops, 2 snow, 1 ice cave, 2 factories, and 7 boss stages. And most of those levels, except maybe the first few jungle ones that literally introduce you to the mechanics of the game, are fairly spread out across the game and offer you different and unique challenges with difficulty spikes later on in the game, and contain tweaks to the aesthetics in multiple cases too. There were repeating themes in the sequel as well, and perhaps just as many quote-unquote dull, generic, and frustrating moments as you'd find in this title, or really any other AAA platformer from that generation. And there are a handful of people that make a case that Donkey Kong Country 1 is better than Donkey Kong Country 2, and again, I'm not sure if I'm one of them or not. But to hear defenders chalk it down to strictly being due to nostalgia and wholeheartedly disagreeing with their assessments, as if it's such an absurd and out there belief, is quite frankly disrespectful to everything Donkey Kong Country 1 accomplished. And I'm not even speaking from a nostalgia perspective, because I owned both DKC 1 and 2 as a child. I remember the day we bought DKC 2. Let's go back to the mid-90s. I remember playing games as a kid before I turned 5. I already told you about Mario's Time Machine, a soccer game called Goal by Jellicoe that I'm way too nostalgic for. But all of those games were games that I didn't really know any better the first time I played them. I didn't put them into the console. I didn't choose to play them. I was just going with the crowd around me. My older brother was super protective of the Super Nintendo, and I was never allowed to play it by myself, so I didn't really have a choice. But around the age of 5, I'll never forget the day I walked into our game room unescorted, feeling like I was breaking a rule but convinced that I was old enough and mature enough to play a video game on my own. Moving over to our box of Super Nintendo game cartridges, and seeing a bunch of games I hadn't played before. I didn't realize it back then, but this would be my earliest memory of the first time I actually got to pick the game that I wanted to play. I don't even remember if I knew how to read, but what I did know is when I saw that big ape with that red tie, it was destined that I cherish this game for the rest of my life. Donkey Kong Country 2 is the greatest 2D platformer of all time. Or at least that's what I've heard for over 20 years. I've often found myself flip-flopping whether I agree with the sentiment or not. And going into this video, I wanted to move closer towards a conclusion. But I think before we can move towards a more concrete opinion, we first need to analyze what it means to be the greatest 2D platformer of all time. Objectively speaking, being the greatest anything of all time is something generally hard to quantify. So how does an opinion so extreme become so mainstream? In order to move quicker towards the point, I'll remove all the nuance and assume you already know that Mario and Sonic were the kings of the genre. The late 80s were for Mario and the early 90s were for Sonic. And just as Sonic's final game released, everyone was able to transition over to Donkey Kong, and the Big Ape would reign supreme for the next 5 years. Right? Well, no. Because the next year, the 3D platformer arrived and effectively killed the 2D platformer until its renaissance in the mid to late 2000s. To be fair, the 2D platformer wasn't really killed, but it was relegated to an afterthought or a handheld genre for a good while. As a result, many people's last real 2D platforming experience, that being the experience why the 2D platformer was still the king, was Donkey Kong Country 2. Especially since Donkey Kong Country 3 released after the Nintendo 64 had already come out. So naturally, over the next 10 to 15 years, people had viewed Donkey Kong Country 2 as the swan song of the genre. The last big hurrah, if you will. So even though it is an exceptional game, it was largely exaggerated as a result, deservedly or otherwise. Which meant that even with a 2D platformer renaissance, the masses still continued to believe this was the greatest 2D platformer, even though games that built off of everything DKC2 did, and other giants of the era did, were probably objectively better games. So right off the bat, when I think of the greatest of all time statements for Donkey Kong Country 2, I don't usually decipher them to mean greatest of all time. Rather, I view these arguments to mean it's the greatest of the classic 2D platforming era. Additionally, I often wonder if DKC2 was also seen as a compromise of that era. Sonic and Mario fans were never going to agree. For every argument for Mario World or Mario 3, Sonic 2 and 3 had a million counter-arguments, and vice versa. Therefore, in an effort to make an entire generation effectively shut up and agree, it seemed like having DKC2 take the mantle was the only logical solution. Again, deservedly or otherwise. But anyway, this is all to say that while I do think Donkey Kong Country 2 is amazing, I think the mainstream opinion that it's the greatest 2D platformer of all time had a lot to do with the discussion at hand. I don't actually remember too much about the release window of Donkey Kong Country 2, titled Diddy's Conquest, by the way. I probably should have mentioned that earlier, but I tend to assume my viewers know this kind of stuff. I don't really remember the hype or the reception. It's not really something I've heard discussed or analyzed over time. It feels like its release was so sudden, and yet somehow literally everyone I knew picked this game up. My experience with this game was interesting. This might be the earliest game I remember my family purchasing. I had to have been about 5 or 6 years old, sitting in the back seat of our station wagon with my two brothers, remembering my dad getting into the car and suddenly reaching his hand to the back with a box in his hand. A new copy of Donkey Kong Country 2. I don't really know how this came about. I assume my older brother had pleaded with my dad to buy it. I didn't know there was even a sequel to the Donkey Kong game available. But I do remember seeing my older brother freak out excitedly, and me and my younger brother joining in when we realized it was Diddy Kong on the cover. It's funny because the reason I have so much nostalgia for that crazy Nintendo 64 kid video is because receiving Donkey Kong Country 2 in the car that day was my personal crazy Nintendo 64 kid moment. It was the only time I was legitimately blindsided by a game, and as a result, thoroughly lost my mind. And it probably helps that the game was phenomenal. You all know my affinity for characters that can fly by now, and Dixie Kong was no different. If I gravitated towards Diddy when playing Donkey Kong Country 1, I almost exclusively used Dixie in the sequel. She's basically Diddy with that extra hover. And it's funny because I never used to think her hair was blonde hair. My dumb 5-year-old self thought it was impossible for a monkey to have blonde hair, and instead it was a magical banana attached to her hat that allowed her to fly. Regardless, Dixie was now my go-to character. It's kind of funny because in a series based around Donkey Kong, I never liked to play with the protagonist. Maybe that was intentional on Rare's part, because it seems like the only reason their games are even called Donkey Kong is because they wanted to appeal to both their Nintendo overlords and the masses alike, while allowing their original characters to be the fan favorites by making them more enjoyable to control. But I think that's enough fumbling around. I've talked about the reputation, I've talked about my early memories. Now it's time to delve deep into Crocodile Isle and talk about Diddy's conquest to save Donkey Kong in Country 2, Diddy's Kong Quest. You know how in the leaps between each Sonic game or the evolution through the Mario games, you can pinpoint the differences and see how each game evolved from the last? Well, that's not really a thing here. I'm not saying there's no improvement at all in this game from its predecessor, but it just feels like more Donkey Kong, and that's not a bad thing at all. The music and aesthetics, while absolutely jaw-dropping for the time, I would describe the exact same way as I described Donkey Kong Country 1. Don't take me glossing over them as a sign of distaste downplaying just how iconic they were, but I don't really think I can add more to the conversation than has already been discussed, especially when it comes to the music, because I'm not an expert when it comes to the game music at all. By my estimation, there are 3 main changes compared to Donkey Kong Country 1 that are worth discussing. Maybe 5 depending on how detailed you want to get. The first being the obvious one. DK is no longer controllable. Which, come to think of it, isn't all that odd considering in the very first Donkey Kong ever made, he wasn't controllable either. In his place we have Dixie Kong, and along with Diddy, they set out to rescue a kidnapped Donkey Kong from King K. Rool. The second main change would be the setting. Unlike Kong Island, Crocodile Isle isn't as realistic of a location as DKC1 is, if that's the correct word to use. Even some of the baddies this time around feel more arcadey than the last game, which I think is for the better. It's not so much of a change that it completely alters the experience, but where DKC1 flourished in a pseudo-realistic atmosphere, DKC2 throws you in settings that feel like they could have been designed by Hayao Miyazaki. There's still that incredible sense of atmosphere, it just feels more like a dream. The third main change involves the animal buddies, or rather the additional ones. Winky was replaced with Rattly, not sure why, but it is what it is. Rambi, OnGuard, and Squawks all make a return, albeit this time Squawks is actually an animal buddy rather than just a flashlight. Both him and Quawks are controllable during flying sections, with the only difference being Squawks has the ability to spit projectiles at baddies. This time the flashlight role is taken up by Glimmer in the underwater levels. But let's be real, Glimmer and Clapper the Seal are more like parts of a stage rather than baddies. The best animal buddy though has gotta be Squitter the Spider. I love his sections. They're the best ones of the series by far, and allow for an interesting take on exploration and platforming. All in all, the animal buddies feel like they take more of a significant role in this game than they did in the last one, and they're more memorable as a result. Fourth change, vertical platforming, is a lot more common in this game. If memory serves me correct, that wasn't really a thing in the last game. Not that it really changes all that much, but I thought it was worth pointing out. And the final change is related to how full completion is achieved and how bonus stages are much more in your face than in the previous title. For that reason, I'd recommend going for full completion a lot more in this title than I would the last one. And technically, you can't play the whole game if you don't go for full completion. Or if you know the cheat to automatically be granted all the collectible coins, which I may or may not have done for this playthrough just for the sake of time. Ah, shut up, Cranky, I don't care about your opinion of me, nor do I feel inadequate losing to these legends on the screen. Aside from these points, I don't think there are any other changes worth highlighting from the previous game. Well, at least off the top of my head. I'm sure there are one or two major differences that I didn't point out that are slipping my mind at the moment. Anyway, there are about 14 unique level settings throughout this game, which is only like one or two more than what Donkey Kong Country 1 had. I feel like it's important to stress that because everyone likes to talk about how DKC 2 is this super amazingly unique experience with all these levels being completely different than the previous ones, whereas really, it's more in line to the same type of uniqueness and repetitiveness in the previous game. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that here, just as there was nothing wrong with in DKC 1. You can kinda see the similarity right away in the first world, Gangplank Gallon. In DKC 1, the majority of World 1 took place in jungle levels, and likewise, most of the jungle levels took place in World 1. Here, it's all about ship deck, ship mast, and ship hold, which are great introductions to the game and throw the pirate theme in your face right off the bat. After all, this game is not only the third best-selling SNES game, but also one of the best-selling pirate games of all time. Yeah, eat your heart out, Assassin's Creed Black Flag. Diddy's Conquest did it 20 years ago. As you move into World 2, Crocodile Cauldron, you're introduced to the lava-themed levels, as well as the mines, which again add a bit of variety to this game. Something I really admire with this game, as well as its predecessor, is that although these themes are repeating themselves quite often, each level tends to contain new types of challenges in order to keep the game feeling fresh. As a result, it creates a fluid experience that continues to find new ways to test your skills, or at the very least require you to adapt a step higher in the difficulty curve in order to continue moving on. And that becomes blatantly obvious when you reach World 3, Creme Quay. While you do get to experience your first swamp theme in this world, you also return to the pirate-themed decks and mast settings, but this time you're put to the test and required to move through the stages more frantically. I personally feel Creme Quay is when the game shifts from an introduction into an actual adventure. The training wheels are off, and you're now expected to flourish through the stages and master the obstacles thrown in your direction. And then, just for added measure, you get thrown into Bramble Blast. There's been a lot said about the Bramble stages in this game, that being this one and the more iconic and difficult Bramble Scramble. While I have always found them to be frustrating, I appreciate the challenge they provide while testing your reflexes. This might strictly be coming from nostalgia for frustration in the older games, but these stages wouldn't be as memorable as they were if they weren't so frickin' annoying. If World 3 is when the training wheels come off, World 4, Crazy Kremland, well, it's where the game gets crazy. You literally start off in a beehive, make your way over to a roller coaster followed by a Bramble Scramble, back to another roller coaster, then a swamp followed by a beehive again. I don't even think I need to break it down or say something generic about the difficulty curve and the new challenges provided here. Saying the type of levels alone should paint a good enough picture for you. World 5 gives a bit more of an eerie feel and introduces you to a few new challenges that focus more on the mastery of mechanics you learned in previous levels. I personally really enjoy Web Woods, but that's because I'm a huge fan of Squitter. It really gives me vibes of the Cloud power-up from Mario Galaxy. I always like a good platforming challenge that requires you to build your own platforms as you move along. Finally, K. Rool's Keep. If you weren't getting the game overs or using save states by this point, then you're definitely going to start here. These levels make Bramble Scramble look like World 1-1 from Super Mario Bros. And I'm not even going to lie and pretend it's because they gave you some interesting platforming challenges or whatever. A lot of the levels in this world are blatantly unfair and require you to play the level and die a few times because of something that was off screen so you can figure out the timing. It's very Sonic-like in that regard. But in this case, it works very well because this is effectively the last world of the game before you get to K. Rool. However, in order to make it to K. Rool, you have to get through Screech's Sprint, which involves encounters with many of the baddies you saw throughout the game, with a few challenges you faced in between. Followed by a flying race against Screech, an angry, reddish parrot that for whatever reason absolutely hates you. Being the last stage leading up to the boss battle, this stage does a very good job of upping the stakes and really challenging you to earn the fight against K. Rool. Now before going to K. Rool's fight, I'd like to give a shout out to the boss battles in this game. They're miles ahead of Donkey Kong Country 1 boss battles, and as a result make them a bit more exciting to face off against. I think the team did a very good job making them feel more unique and less of an afterthought, just like they seemed to be in the previous title. Now, if I'm being completely honest, the final battle against K. Rool isn't all that amazing to me. It definitely fits the bill for iconic 2D boss battles from that era, but I'd argue the boss battles in the first, and heck, even in the third game was better. Honestly, I think the setting of the battle just never really resonated with me. It just isn't quite as memorable or as epic as the other games in the series. But what I did love about it, though, was the ending. Having DK pop out and Shoryuken K. Rool was just so epic. If the game ended here, it'd more than suffice. But in DKC2, there's more incentive to go for full completion. There are 5 stages, plus a second battle against K. Rool that make up what is known as the Lost World. These are some of the best and most challenging levels in the game in my opinion. And obviously my favorite one is Animal Antics, which has to use all of the animals in a row to get through the whole level. Followed by a second fight against K. Rool, which albeit is much better than the first fight as far as boss battles go, but given that it's similar enough to the previous fight with a few more interesting challenges thrown in here and there, I still feel like the setting and environment of the battle doesn't really shine as much as the previous games. Honestly though, I have a fundamental issue with the fact that the Lost World is locked behind full completion. When I was a kid, I liked going for full completion in this game, but the older I get, the less I enjoy it. I'm not really sure exactly what it is about these DKC titles, but the way they have you search for hidden areas to fully complete the game just isn't that fun as a challenge as Mario or Sonic for me. It's also possible that the Donkey Kong games in and of themselves are already difficult enough that it's not as enjoyable to explore, but I think it's the way that characters control in general that bugs me when it comes to exploration. Also, it's very time consuming since you're not just looking for random collectibles as much as looking for bonus areas to grab said collectibles. And honestly, I would be so angry and speak so negatively about this game hiding what is basically the last levels and final boss behind such a long and tedious completionist task, if it wasn't for the fact that they literally built in an in-game cheat to get the 75 Cram Coins. It's one of those old school cheats where you have to obscurely move your character around and avoid the bananas. Something that honestly sounds like it was made up on the playground to unlock a character that doesn't exist in the game. So yeah, this is basically my way of completing the game now. I play through all the levels and just cheat to get to Lost World and beat the game. I just don't have the time and patience to fully complete any of the DKC games anymore. To put it quite simply, I love this game. Shocker, I know. I honestly have very little to critique about it. Minor nitpicks here and there, but they really only surface because I'm doing this video. That being said, I set out to determine whether or not DKC2 was the greatest 2D platformer of all time. Or at the very least during the classic era. An opinion I've always leaned towards but never really thought about. And well, I can't say that it is. I can't even say that it's better than Donkey Kong Country. I'm not saying that the first one is better, but it's definitely not worse than this one. As I mentioned earlier, in the Mario and Sonic games, every time a new title came out, it felt like a drastic improvement over the previous title. And there were enough changes involved where each game basically controlled differently. That's not really the case in the Donkey Kong series. Asking me if I prefer Donkey Kong Country 2 over Donkey Kong Country is like asking me if I prefer Sonic and Knuckles over Sonic 3. The game feels the exact same, and while the stages differ and certain mechanics and challenges might be better in one game over the other, it's close enough of a tie that those differences are negligible. It's very easy for me to say Super Mario World and Sonic 3 and Knuckles are my favorites of the classic eras, because those games were the peaks of those series. Donkey Kong basically peaked with its first title and carried over the momentum by not really needing to change much past the sequel. I know this is kind of a cop-out, and a lot of you are probably wondering if I'd pick a winner between DKC and DKC2, but I honestly can't. These games are short enough and similar enough where if I'm going to play one, I'm probably just going to play the other one right after it. And as a result, the whole experience will feel like one big playthrough. Alright, let's cut to the chase. Kiddy Kong gets way more hate than he deserves. Dixie Kong, being the main protagonist of this game alone, makes it awesome. The soundtrack, changing hands from David Wise to Evelyn Fisher, is the biggest non-issue I've ever seen exaggerated in gaming, and Donkey Kong Country 3 is just as good as its predecessors. Should Kiddy Kong have been Donkey Kong to allow for the trilogy to complete the triangle and have the duo save Diddy Kong? Probably. Would I still have chosen Dixie Kong more than Donkey Kong if he was the other character? Definitely. Is the music in this game drastically worse than the previous two games? Heck no. There are a lot of soundtracks in this game that are so fitting in the setting and environment. The aesthetics are absolutely gorgeous, and in my opinion are the perfect combination between the realistic vibes felt during the first title, and the wackier, more arcadey feel of the second game. There are stages with gimmicks and puzzles and challenges that are so much more interesting and less repetitive than the previous games in the series. Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie's Double Trouble, is, in its own right, a part of the original trilogy, and should be revered in the same manner the first two games are. I have virtually no memory of this game, by the way, nor any nostalgia for it. The only memory I can think of was being at my friend's grandma's house in the mid to late 90s and seeing a show on TV with some guy discussing video games, talking about Donkey Kong Country 3 and Yoshi's Island. I'm pretty sure this memory predates G4 TV or Tech TV as it used to be known before. I have no idea what it was, but it was basically the first experience I ever had watching video game content on television. Like many others, by the time this game released, my family had already moved on to the Nintendo 64. Actually, I feel about DKC 3 the same way I feel about Mario Party 3. The timing of its release, being side by side with the next generation of consoles, made me completely skip over it and as a result, not play it for what felt like the first 15 to 20 years, despite often revisiting its predecessors. With this video, it's actually only my second playthrough of this game. The first time I played it was on the Game Boy Advance version a few years ago. I thought it was okay at the time, but I think playing it right after the first two games and not pausing to write a script or analyze my thoughts burned me out. Plus, I very much was blindly following the general opinion I saw about this game from content creators online, and I accepted it just might not be a good title. This time, however, I came in with a purpose. I took a break between games and was itching to get in with this title with a fresh view and more excitement to really understand what it was about this game that made it so bad. And as a result, I figured out Kitty was never the problem. Everyone else was. I'm not really going to delve too deep into the music and aesthetics, which shouldn't really surprise you if you keep up with my channel. I think the game looks and sounds really good and lives up to the other games in the trilogy. I thought my lack of nostalgia for the music would lower it a few pegs in my estimation, but nope, I think it's totally acceptable, and as far as aesthetics, I'll repeat that I think the environments in this game take the best of both DKC 1 and 2 and apply them into a great mix into DKC 3. The setting and theme of this game is one of the strong suits in my opinion. You've had King K. Rool, Captain K. Rool, and now you have Baron K. Roolenstein, a mad doctor up to no good. I like that K. Rool just casually cosplays a different persona in each game, and with every midlife crisis career change he experiences, his army of baddies has to follow suit and just accept that they're now part of his new persona. Meanwhile, the Kongs just show up like, "Hi, can you stop kidnapping our friends and stealing our bananas?" Speaking of which, there's a whole thing about the bananas in this game having magical powers or whatever. There's a bit more to the story and lore that I'm not really interested in going into because I don't really care about stories in these classic games. Or the quips, or the jokes made by Cranky, or the Brothers Bear, or whatever. And I feel the same about completion of this game as I did in the previous titles, as in I don't really care much for it either. As far as I'm concerned, I play Donkey Kong Country series as a platformer first, and everything else is pretty secondary. And it's secondary enough where I don't really plan on discussing it any further. Anyway, with K. Roolenstein, there comes a mad scientist theme in the game that's actually really enjoyable. Throughout the stages, you'll see baddies that look like they were literally experimented on and basically cyborgs by this point. Some of them even involve some kind of extra thinking to defeat. It's that bit of extra brain power that makes me enjoy this game. I think the best way to exemplify it is a collection of the DK coins. Which, I totally get that I just said I wasn't going to talk about full completion, but grabbing a few DK coins or visiting a few bonus areas isn't really full completion. In order to grab a DK coin, you have to find a way to strike these fellas with a barrel. The trick is they're always shielded towards the direction you're standing, so you have to find a way to make the barrel strike them from the back. These puzzles start off simply enough, but in later stages you'll find yourself scratching your head on how to accomplish them. I think I might have had to look up one or two of these puzzles because of their difficulty, and I was totally okay with that. There are repeating themes, but as the themes repeat, the stages get a bit trickier and add in a few more gimmicks and challenges to make them a bit more enticing, giving you what I would consider a properly established difficulty curve. This time, however, the gimmicks stick out a little more than in the previous games. So rather than just do the same generic description of stages in the different settings, I think I'd much rather pick a few levels that involve specific gimmicks or challenges and talk about those. You can assume any level that I didn't mention to just be a general Donkey Kong Country level or a repeat of a gimmick and with just a bit more challenge. Which is fine, but I don't see a point in discussing them. In World 1, your first unique level is Doorstop Dash. It's the second level of the game, and I imagine for most people that just want to play a basic platformer and move through the game, this has almost certainly turned them off from the game way too early on. You need to maneuver around the stage and find handles that'll open doors for a brief moment of time in order to allow you to advance. Progression requires both exploration and timing, and I think it makes the stage more interesting as a result. Another level set in the same setting in World 1 is Murky Mill. In this level, you control Ellie, an elephant that basically replaced Rambi, which I'm guessing is the second instance of rage that DKC fans face. Ellie is not Rambi, nor is she meant to be Rambi. Heck, you probably could have had both in the game and it wouldn't feel redundant. But because we went from big and powerful Rambi to scared of mice Ellie, everyone had to make a big deal about it. But when you remove the preconceived notions, Ellie is actually a pretty good addition to the challenges in this game. In Murky Mill, she needs to defeat the rats in order to advance, and can only be done by sneaking up on them. Otherwise she'll freak out and run in the opposite direction. I mean really, you're basically getting a Metal Gear Solid game mixed with a Donkey Kong game. What more could you ask for? Barrel Shield Bust Up requires you to use a shield on a rope to climb through the treetops, which is a fun new challenge that wasn't really done in the previous games. Riverside Race is a straight up time trial with a straight up timer in the bottom corner. Squeals on Wheels is similar to the first two mill levels I described, only this time you have to kill these rats on the wheels with barrels to advance and actually have to explore a bit to figure out how to advance. If it wasn't clear, I'm a really big fan of these mill levels. Bobbing Barrel Brawl is really fun. You have to use Ellie to throw barrels into the water at various increments to avoid falling into the water. And again, I have to reiterate how good I think Ellie's implementation was in this game. Tracker Barrel Trek gets a shout out for having a good barrel gimmick, a good implementation of Ellie's spitting water ability, a gorgeous environment in these waterfall themed levels, and a pretty good DK coin puzzle to boot. Fish Food Frenzy is probably my favorite one though. You have this fish following you and you need to swim close to other fish to feed it. If you don't feed it, it'll slowly turn red and eventually attack you. If you feed it the wrong food, it also yields the same result. Some of the most stress-inducing moments I experienced in this game, actually in the series, were in this level. Blazing Bazookas gives you a fun and unique challenge due to these baddies firing barrels at you. You'll have to avoid the TNT barrels, jump on the regular ones to get across the gaps. At some point, you're also treated with Squidder the Spider, who is probably my favorite animal buddy in the series by this point. His ability to spit out web projectiles and create platforms for himself to use make him the perfect buddy for this level. Immediately after you get to Low G Labyrinth, which is so cool strictly because of how the low gravity gimmick works. It's nothing too spectacular or different, but it's the first time something like this is done in a main stage, so it stands out quite a bit. Next you have Crackshot Croc, which basically turns you into a target of a shooter. You need to traverse through the level and take cover away from the crosshair before Croc shoots a fireball at you. Buzzer Barrage requires you to use Quox, the animal buddy without a projectile ability, to drop steel barrels onto baddies to advance through the stage. In some cases, however, you can't directly drop the barrel onto a baddie, so you need to find a way to make it roll into them to advance. Confused Cliffs ups the ante by forcing you to speed up the cliffs while the rope you're on slowly burns towards you. Floodlit Fish requires you to control Unguard to slam into these glowing fish to traverse through the dark underwater level. By the way, I love the look of these underwater stages. They rival the ones from the first game, and the ambiance is better in this title in my opinion. Pothole Panic makes a fun run through a level requiring the use of 4 different animal buddies to advance, each holding their own challenge along the way. Ropey Rumpus isn't what I would consider super unique, but man is it hard to get through the first time you play it. Creepy Caverns literally contains ghost barrels. Lightning Lookout sees you literally trying to avoid being struck by lightning. Poisonous Pipeline is a swimming level that reverses the right and left directions, which, similar to the gravity level, is such a neat and unique gimmick that it alone makes it worth a mention. All of those levels takes you through the main game, and the extra area, or Lost World of this game, is known as Krematoa, which contains some of the most challenging levels of the game by far, and a second boss battle against K. Rulenstein. Phew, that was a lot to go through. I mentioned way more stages than I thought I would, and I think that's just a testament to just how unique and challenging this game can be if you go into it in the right mindset. And I didn't even discuss the boss battles, which continue on the trend of DKC2 and being unique and fun battles. The fight against Baron K. Rulenstein is cool too, and the varying phases of the fight, you actually have to try a little bit harder than in the previous 2 games. I know people like to crap on this game for the story, or Kitty, or whatever else is in the flavor of the week at the time, but honestly, if you're looking at it for face value, I think it's actually a better all-around experience than the first 2 titles. The reason I say that is because pretty much every type of stage gimmick, or challenge, or explanation aspect that was seen in the first 2 games is done again here, and then some. The upgraded visuals is so blatantly obvious, the unique mad scientist theme and all these deranged baddies as a result, and all of the crazy puzzles I ran through in the stages makes for such a memorable experience that quite frankly amazes me that this game doesn't get more praise. There might be something to be said about the story, minimal cutscenes, music, and even completion challenges that might make someone prefer the previous 2 titles over this one, and I'm not going to pretend I care enough about any of those aspects to make an argument for or against DKC3, but what I do know is that sitting down and playing through all of these stages felt good. Like really good. As good, if not better, than the previous 2 games. I left off Donkey Kong Country 2's video wondering whether or not I personally could group the 3rd game with the first 2, and I can honestly say that I absolutely can. The next time I want to get my Donkey Kong fill, I might just play this game first so I don't burn out on the first 2 games before I experience this one. Actually, for any viewers watching it, if you haven't played DKC in a while, I recommend doing just that. Play the 3rd game. you might find a new appreciation for it. Or if it's your first time playthrough, you might find the same appreciation for it that I found. I don't really think DKC 3 is so much drastically better than the first two games that it makes that much of a difference to rank them, but I do think it's better than the first two games enough that I can say with confidence that it's a minor improvement on DKC 1 and 2. And why wouldn't it be? In the same vein that Sonic and Mario managed to make their games better as they moved along, I firmly believe Rare managed to create a game with improvements over its predecessors. At the end of the day though, my opinion is still that all three DKC games are close enough in quality that ranking them seems pointless. The only reason I'm saying the third is better is because it's been hated for so many years that I think it's worth pointing out that I do indeed find it better. But at the end of the day, I love this whole trilogy. And the improvements are so minor across the series that I would always recommend playing all three of them. I recently did a Mario vs. Sonic series where I stated Sonic 3 and Mario World are my favorite titles of the classics. If I was doing a tier system, those two games would be S ranks, and Mario 3 and Sonic 2 would be just under them. Well, all three DKC games would be S ranks as well. I can't in good conscience place them anywhere else, because these games released at the peak of 2D platforming. It's a good thing we switched over to the third dimension shortly after, because I don't think we could have really improved much more after the Donkey Kong Country games back in the 90s. Anyway, that's all I really have to say. I will continue my journey through Rare on Nintendo 64. I'm not sure when, so I can't really give you guys a heads up or a hint of what's to come at this moment because I haven't really decided yet. As always, thanks for watching.